The chill of Halloween night hung in the air, crisp and heavy. Sam stood at the edge of the small town's central square, staring at the sudden appearance of something that hadn't been there the day before. A carnival. It hadn't been on any schedule or advertised, but there it was, like it had materialized out of thin air. This place wasn't here yesterday, was it? Sam asked, looking at his younger sister, Lisa. She shook her head, her wide eyes fixed on the entrance. No, but I dreamed about it. Sam looked at her, a little uneasy. Lisa had been having strange dreams for weeks now, nightmares about a dark place filled with twisted figures and flickering lights. He had brushed it off as Halloween jitters. But now, with the carnival standing there, rusted, eerie, almost pulsing with some unseen energy, he wasn't so sure. "Dude, this place is creepy as hell," Charlie muttered. He was already starting to take a few steps back, clearly uncomfortable. Charlie was never one for scary stuff. Sam glanced at him, grinning. "Come on, man. It's just a carnival. We're not going to turn into pumpkins." "I dunno. It feels wrong, like we shouldn't be here," Charlie said, his voice low, cautious. Lisa tugged on Sam's jacket, her face pale in the dim light. "We shouldn't go in. Not this place. It's like the one in my dreams." "Dreams aren't real, Lisa," Sam said, although his voice sounded a little less confident than he'd meant it to. But the flashing lights and the muffled music that drifted from within the carnival gates felt off. Something about it wasn't quite right. The colors were too dull, the lights flickered too sporadically, and the whole thing had this washed-out, decaying look. Still, despite his sister's unease, Sam couldn't shake the curiosity gnawing at him. "Just a quick look," he said. "We'll check out the main rides and leave if it's too weird." Lisa hesitated, biting her lip, but eventually nodded. Charlie, on the other hand, mumbled something about regretting this, but followed as they moved closer to the entrance. As they walked past the entrance sign, crudely written in fading letters that spelled out Lost Souls Carnival, Sam felt a wave of cold wash over him. It wasn't just the temperature, it was something deeper, something crawling beneath the surface of the night. But still, they pressed on. Once inside, the carnival seemed even more dilapidated than it had from the outside. The rides were old, almost ancient, with rusted metal creaking in the wind. A carousel spun slowly in the distance, its horses chipped and weathered. There were no crowds, just a few shadowy figures wandering around, their faces obscured by the dim light. "Okay, now I'm officially freaked out," Charlie whispered, his voice trembling. "We're just here for a little fun," Sam said, trying to keep things light. But he felt it too. That sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. Something was wrong here. Very wrong. The trio wandered deeper into the park, passing by empty food stalls and abandoned games. The only sound was the soft whine of the wind and the distant, distorted carnival music that played on an endless loop. Then they saw it. The Tunnel of Terror. A massive decaying structure loomed in front of them, the ride's entrance shaped like the gaping mouth of a grotesque clown. The paint was peeling, and its eyes glowed a sickly yellow. "That's the one," Lisa said, her voice barely a whisper. "From my dreams." Sam stared at the tunnel, feeling his stomach twist. He wasn't sure if it was fear or something worse, but he couldn't look away. The dark entrance seemed to beckon them, pulling them in with an invisible force. "This is messed up," Charlie muttered, backing away. "Let's get out of here." But before Sam could respond, the tunnel's lights flickered, and the entrance creaked open wider, like the mouth of a beast preparing to swallow them whole. "We should leave," Lisa said, tugging at Sam's arm. "Now." Sam was about to agree when something caught his eye. A figure, tall and thin, stood at the far end of the carnival, barely visible through the swirling mist. The figure watched them, unmoving. Then, as if on cue, a deep voice boomed from the tunnel entrance. "Step right in, if you dare." Sam's heart raced as he stared into the yawning maw of the Tunnel of Terror. The voice that had called out was low, gravelly, like it was coming from beneath the earth itself. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to turn back, to leave this place and never look back. But something else, curiosity or maybe pride, kept him rooted to the spot. "We're not seriously going in there, right?" Charlie asked, his eyes wide with fear. Lisa was gripping Sam's arm tightly, her knuckles white. "Please, Sam, we can still leave." But Sam was already stepping forward. "It's just a ride. he said, trying to convince himself more than the others. "A haunted house on wheels. We'll be fine." He climbed into one of the old, creaky cars that sat on the tracks, motioning for Lisa and Charlie to join him. Charlie hesitated, but eventually he climbed in next to them, glancing around nervously. As soon as they were seated, the car jolted forward, the metal wheels grinding against the tracks. The lights in the tunnel flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls as they moved deeper into the dark. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of rust and something else. Something sour. The deeper they went, the stranger it became. The cheesy Halloween props they'd expected were nowhere to be found. Instead, the walls seemed to shift and move, like they were alive. Faint whispers echoed through the tunnel, voices too soft to understand but too unsettling to ignore. This isn't right," Charlie stammered, gripping the side of the car. Sam felt it too. The air was thick, oppressive. Something was watching them. Lisa was silent, her eyes wide and unblinking as she stared straight ahead. "We shouldn't be here," she said softly. "This place, it's not just a ride." Suddenly, the car came to a screeching halt. Everything went pitch black. Sam's heart pounded in his chest as he strained to see anything, but the darkness was suffocating, complete. Then, just as suddenly, a light flickered on ahead of them. It was dim, barely illuminating the space in front of the car. And there, standing in the middle of the tracks, was a figure. It was tall and thin, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its face was obscured, hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching. "What the hell is that?" Charlie whispered, his voice trembling. Before Sam could answer, the car lurched forward again, faster this time. The figure didn't move, but as they passed by it, Sam could feel its eyes on him, burning into his soul. Then everything went dark again. The car emerged from the tunnel, but instead of the cheesy carnival exit Sam had expected, they found themselves in an open space, shrouded in mist. The ground beneath them was no longer the worn tracks of the ride, but soft, damp earth. In the distance, figures moved through the fog, pale, twisted figures that barely resembled humans. Where are we?" Charlie stammered, his voice cracking. Sam's breath caught in his throat. This isn't part of the ride." Lisa was staring ahead, her eyes wide with horror. "This is the place from my dreams," she whispered. The figures in the mist moved closer, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. Their bodies were twisted, deformed, like they had been stretched and broken over and over again. They reached out with bony hands, their mouths opening and closing as if they were trying to speak. But no sound came out. Sam backed away, his heart racing. "We have to get out of here." "They're trapped," Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're lost, souls that can't leave." "How do you know that?" Sam asked, his voice trembling. I don't know. I just feel it." Charlie was already backing away, shaking his head. "This is insane. We need to go. Now." But as they turned to leave, the ground shifted beneath them. The figures in the mist began to close in, their movements slow but relentless. "We're not getting out of here, are we?" Sam whispered, his voice filled with dread. Lisa looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. "Not unless we find the portal." Sam, Lisa, and Charlie ran, their feet pounding against the soft, shifting earth. The figures in the mist were closing in, their hollow eyes watching, their bony fingers reaching out. Sam's heart raced as he glanced back, the twisted forms of the lost souls haunting their every step. Up ahead, through the thick fog, they saw it, a tall, dark figure standing at the edge of the carnival grounds. It was the same figure they had seen in the tunnel, the one with the wide-brimmed hat and the obscured face. "The keeper," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move as they approached. It stood still, watching them with unseen eyes. Sam's breath caught in his throat as they got closer. There was something about this figure. Something ancient. Something wrong. "You've seen too much," the figure said, its voice deep and gravelly like the rumble of distant thunder. "You shouldn't have come here." Sam stepped forward, his voice shaking. "Who are you? What is this place?" The keeper tilted its head slightly as if considering his questions. "This is my domain," it said slowly. "A place where lost souls come to find their eternal rest." "Rest?" Charlie spat. "They're not resting. They're trapped." The keeper turned its gaze to Charlie, the shadows shifting around its face. "They are trapped because they belong here. just as you now belong." Sam's heart sank. "We don't belong here," he said, his voice shaking. "We're still alive." The keeper let out a low chuckle. "For now." Lisa stepped forward, her eyes filled with defiance. "There's a way out. I've seen it, in my dreams." The keeper's gaze shifted to her, its expression unreadable. "Your dreams are nothing more than a reflection of this place," it said softly. "You cannot escape." Sam felt the ground shift beneath him again, the carnival around them warping and twisting like it was alive. The keeper's presence loomed over them, dark and imposing. He couldn't let this be the end. Not for him, not for Lisa, not for Charlie. "You're wrong," Sam said, his voice rising. "We're not staying here. We're going home." The keeper laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent shivers down Sam's spine. "There is no home for you anymore. You've crossed the threshold. You belong to the carnival now." Sam looked at Lisa, who nodded, determination in her eyes. "The portal," she whispered. "It's here, somewhere." Without thinking, Sam grabbed her hand and started running again, pulling Charlie with them. The keeper's laugh echoed behind them as the ground shifted and cracked beneath their feet. The figures in the mist were everywhere now, reaching for them with twisted hands. "There!" Lisa shouted, pointing ahead. Through the fog, Sam saw it, a swirling vortex of light shimmering in the darkness. "The portal!" "Go!" he shouted, pushing Lisa and Charlie forward. The ground shook violently as they ran, the figures closing in. Sam could feel their cold fingers brushing against his skin, trying to pull him back. But he wouldn't let them. They reached the portal just as the keeper's shadow loomed over them, its voice a low growl. "You can't escape." Sam didn't hesitate. He grabbed Lisa and Charlie and pushed them through the portal. The last thing he heard was the keeper's voice, echoing in his mind. "You'll be back. You always come back." And then everything went dark. When Sam opened his eyes, he was back in the town square, lying on the cold pavement. Lisa and Charlie were beside him, both gasping for breath. The carnival was gone, vanished like it had never been there in the first place. But Sam knew better. It was still out there, somewhere, waiting for its next victims. The old, weathered house stood atop the hill, overlooking the town of Salem like a silent sentinel. Its windows, half covered with age-worn curtains, stared blankly down at the cobblestone streets below. Megan, Jake, Emily, and Travis piled out of their car, all filled with a mix of excitement and nerves, as they took in the sight of their temporary Halloween residence. Megan adjusted her glasses and smiled as she gazed up at the house. "This place is perfect," she said, her voice bubbling with curiosity. "Do you guys know how much history is tied to Salem? Witch trials, mysterious deaths?" Jake rolled his eyes, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "It's just an old house, Meg. People love to make up stories to spook tourists. You'll see." Megan replied, grinning. "There's real history here. We're standing where legends were made." Travis, always the joker, Mock shivered. "Ooh, spooky. Do you think we'll see some witches? Or maybe a ghost? I'm ready, man, bring it on." Emily, quiet up until now, frowned as she rubbed her arms. "I don't know, guys. Something feels off. Like, really off." Jake sighed and shook his head. "Come on, Emily. It's all in your head. You've been watching too many of those paranormal shows." Emily shrugged, but the uneasy feeling in her gut didn't go away. The house loomed over them, dark and imposing, the chill of the late autumn air settling in as the sun began to sink behind the horizon. They entered the house, greeted by the musty smell of old wood and dust. It was as if time had forgotten the place. The furniture was antique, and everything looked frozen in the past. Yet, there was an unshakable feeling that something or someone had been watching them since they set foot inside. "Well, we better get settled," Megan said, setting her bag down on a dusty chair. "We've got a whole week here to explore." "Hell yeah," Travis said, clapping his hands together. "Let's crank up the scary movies, light some candles, and make it a Halloween to remember." But as they all started to unpack, Emily couldn't help but glance around nervously. The feeling of being watched was growing stronger. The first night passed uneventfully. They drank, laughed, and watched horror movies late into the night, their earlier nerves fading away in the glow of the television. Megan, ever the history buff, kept talking about the witch trials, sharing stories of Salem's dark past. "Do you guys know about Abigail Craven?" she asked, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "She was one of the last witches tried in Salem. They say she cursed the town with her dying breath." Jake smirked. "Oh yeah? And what was her curse? That people would be scared out of their minds by cheesy horror movies?" Megan rolled her eyes. "No, smartass. She swore revenge on the people who wronged her, said she'd never rest until those responsible suffered for what they did to her. Rumor has it she lived right here, on this hill." Travis leaned forward, grinning. "Wait, you're saying this house belonged to a witch? Awesome. Maybe we can summon her ghost or something." Emily, who had been sitting silently in the corner, shivered. She didn't like where this was going. "Guys, can we not? This stuff isn't funny." "Come on, Em," Travis said, grinning. "What's the worst that could happen?" That night, after everyone had gone to bed, the house fell into a deep, unsettling silence. Emily tossed and turned, sleep eluding her as the unease from earlier returned with full force. She could hear faint creaks and groans from the old wood settling. But something else, something far more sinister, seemed to be lurking just beyond the walls. She sat up, her heart racing as she swore she saw a shadow dart across the doorway. "Hello?" she whispered into the darkness, but there was no answer. Only the faintest hint of a breeze, like a whisper in her ear. The next morning, Emily awoke to find a strange symbol etched into the window by her bed. It hadn't been there the night before. When she showed it to the others, they brushed it off as some old marking. "It's probably just scratched into the glass from years of wear," Jake said dismissively, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. Megan, however, was intrigued. "That looks like a protection symbol," she said, her brow furrowed. "It's the kind of thing people would carve into their homes back in the day to keep evil spirits out." Emily paled. "Or to trap them inside," she muttered under her breath. By the third day, things had taken a darker turn. Strange things started happening around the house. Footsteps in the attic when no one was up there, objects moving on their own, doors slamming shut without warning. At first, they all chalked it up to the house's age and creaky floorboards, but soon it became impossible to ignore. Megan spent most of her time researching in the library, poring over old books and documents about Salem's history. She was convinced the house had a deeper connection to the witch trials than they had initially realized. "This house, it was built on land that belonged to Abigail Craven," Megan said one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. "She wasn't just some random witch accused by her neighbors. She was a healer, a midwife. But when the trials began, people turned on her. They said she was responsible for the deaths of several children in the town. She was hanged right here on this hill." Jake raised an eyebrow. "So what? That doesn't mean anything. It's just history." Megan shook her head. "It's more than that. I found references to strange happenings after her death. People disappearing, strange deaths in the town. There were rumors that her spirit was still here, seeking revenge." Travis laughed, though his voice wavered slightly. "Okay, now you're freaking me out." Emily, who had been sitting quietly, spoke up. "She's still here. I've felt it since the moment we arrived." The others turned to look at her, the atmosphere in the room suddenly growing tense. "She's watching us," Emily continued, her voice barely a whisper. "And she's angry." That night, the house came alive with activity. Emily was the first to notice it. Whispers in the dark, low and unintelligible, but there nonetheless. She lay frozen in bed, unable to move as the sound grew louder, closer. Then, all at once, it stopped. The door to her room creaked in slowly, and a cold draft filled the space. Emily sat up, her heart pounding, as a figure appeared in the doorway. Dark, shadowy, and indistinct, but unmistakably human. It hovered there for a moment before vanishing into the hallway. Terrified, she scrambled out of bed and ran to the others. They were all awake, faces pale with fear. "Did you hear that?" Travis asked, his voice shaking. "There were voices, like someone was in my room." "It's her," Emily said, her voice trembling. "Abigail." Megan shook her head, though her eyes were wide with fear. "There has to be an explanation. Maybe it's the wind, or the house settling." Before she could finish, a loud crash echoed from downstairs. They all jumped, hearts racing. Jake grabbed a flashlight, and they made their way to the source of the noise. In the living room, the furniture had been overturned, and the windows were wide open, letting the cold night air seep in. On the floor, Scrawled in what looked like ashes was a message. "The trial is not over." Panic set in. Megan and Jake wanted to leave the house, but Travis insisted it was all some kind of prank. Emily, however, was convinced that Abigail's spirit had returned, and she was not here to play games. The next few hours were filled with chaos. Doors slammed shut, locking them in rooms. Strange noises echoed through the halls, and the temperature dropped to an unbearable chill. Every shadow seemed to move, every whisper seemed louder than before. They gathered in the living room, huddled together as the night grew darker, fear taking hold of them. "We have to apologize," Emily said, her voice shaky but determined. "We've disturbed something and it won't stop until we make it right." Jake scoffed. "Make it right? How? You're talking about a spirit, Em, not a person." Megan, however, looked thoughtful. "There might be a way," she said, pulling out her research notes. "During the trials, Abigail wasn't allowed to defend herself. What if we gave her that chance?" Travis frowned. "You want us to put a ghost on trial? Are you insane?" Megan shook her head. "Not exactly. But if we perform some kind of ritual, maybe we can communicate with her, let her tell her side of the story." Desperate, they agreed. Megan quickly gathered materials, candles, an old book she had found in the house's library, and a handful of herbs from the kitchen. They formed a circle in the living room, the air thick with tension as Megan began to chant the ancient words from the book. The room grew colder, the shadows longer, and suddenly, the candles flickered out. Darkness enveloped them, and a voice, soft, angry, filled the space. "I was wronged," it whispered. "I will have my justice." As the voice spoke, the temperature plummeted. Emily could barely see the others in the dark, but she could feel the presence looming over them. Cold hands seemed to brush her skin, and her breath came out in sharp, shallow gasps. Megan, her voice shaking, called out, "We want to hear your side. We want to know the truth." The shadows in the room shifted, and in the dim light of the now flickering candles, the shape of a woman appeared. She was translucent, her eyes filled with a cold, ancient rage. Abigail Craven had returned. "They hanged me for crimes I did not commit," she whispered, her voice full of venom. "They took everything from me. My life, my family, my soul." The group watched in horror as images flickered across the room, scenes from the past of Abigail's trial, of her being dragged to the gallows, pleading for mercy. "I was innocent," Abigail hissed, "but they did not care. Now you will take their place." Travis screamed as the ghostly form lunged at him, knocking him to the ground. The others scrambled to their feet, but the house had become a maze of darkness and terror, the doors and windows locked tight, trapping them inside. Emily, heart racing, stepped forward, her voice trembling. "We're not like them. We didn't come here to harm you." Abigail's spirit paused, her hollow eyes fixating on Emily. "Then why do you disturb me?" she demanded. "Why do you walk the halls of my torment?" "We didn't know," Emily pleaded. "We're sorry, but we can help you find peace." For a moment, the room fell silent, the weight of the centuries-old injustice hanging heavy in the air. Then slowly, Abigail's form began to fade. "You cannot undo what was done," she said, her voice barely a whisper now, "but you can remember." With that, the house fell silent once more. The candles flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. When they finally found the strength to move, the door creaked open on its own, releasing them into the cold, crisp night. The next morning, they left the house without a word. No one dared speak of what had happened during the night. Salem, with its Halloween festivities in full swing, seemed oblivious to the horror that had unfolded on the hill. As they drove away, Emily glanced back at the house. It stood there, silent and empty, as if nothing had ever happened. But she knew better. Abigail Craven's story wasn't over, it had simply been forgotten. And now, it would be remembered. Ethan stared out the window of the old, creaky station wagon as it rumbled down the lonely country road. The sun was setting behind the dense woods, casting long, eerie shadows across the fields. It had been days since they moved to this remote town in Illinois, and Ethan still wasn't used to how quiet everything felt. The isolation hung in the air, thick and heavy, as if the trees themselves were watching. His mom, Sarah, was behind the wheel, eyes glued to the road ahead. "I know this isn't what you wanted, but it'll be good for us," she said, her voice tired but hopeful. A fresh start. Ethan didn't respond. His dad had left a few months ago, and moving to this strange, forgotten place wasn't exactly his idea of a fresh start. The house they'd bought was an old Victorian-style relic, perched on the edge of town, surrounded by dense woods. It was cheap, though, and that's all his mom cared about. As they pulled into the driveway, Ethan noticed the way the trees seemed to close in around the house, as if guarding some hidden secret. He shivered but brushed it off. It was probably just the cold. The house groaned as they stepped inside, floors creaking under their weight. Sarah began unpacking, humming quietly to herself, trying to make the place feel like home. But Ethan could feel it, that strange, uneasy tension that lingered in every room, in every shadow. "Why don't you explore the backyard?" his mom suggested after a while, glancing at him. "There's a whole forest back there. Might be good to get some fresh air." Ethan sighed, but grabbed his jacket and headed out. The backyard was a sprawling mess of overgrown grass and gnarled trees. Beyond it, the forest loomed, dark and thick, like something out of a nightmare. He wandered deeper into the woods, the cool air biting at his skin. The further he went, the quieter it got, until the only sound was the crunch of leaves under his feet. That's when he saw it. Carved into the bark of a massive oak tree was a symbol, a circle, with jagged lines cutting through it like a twisted sun. Ethan frowned, reaching out to trace the lines with his fingers. It felt old, ancient even, but the carving was sharp, as if someone had made it recently. A sudden gust of wind rattled the trees, and Ethan took a step back, glancing around. The woods felt darker now, more oppressive. He didn't like it. He turned and hurried back toward the house. The symbol burned into his mind. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next few days passed in a blur of unpacking and settling in, but that symbol haunted him. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, just some kids messing around in the woods. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. One afternoon, after school, he decided to go back and take another look. He grabbed a flashlight, just in case, and headed into the woods. The sun was setting again, casting the forest in a deep, reddish glow. As he reached the tree, his heart skipped a beat. There were more symbols now, not just on the oak, but on several trees around it. Circles, triangles, jagged lines, they were everywhere, carved into the bark like some sort of ancient language. Ethan crouched down, inspecting the ground around the tree. That's when he saw them, small, neatly stacked stones arranged in a perfect circle. In the center, something glinted in the fading light. He reached out, brushing away the leaves to reveal a rusted old knife, the blade stained and dull. A sudden rustling in the bushes made him freeze. He whipped around, flashlight in hand, shining it into the dark woods. Nothing. Just the wind. But then he heard it. Whispering. Faint, almost like a distant echo, but unmistakable. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he stood up, backing away from the tree. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like 100 voices speaking all at once. He bolted, racing through the trees, not stopping until he was back at the house. Slamming the door behind him, he stood there, panting, listening to the sound of his own heartbeat. The woods outside were silent again. "What's going on with you?" Sarah asked, looking up from the kitchen, concern etched on her face. "Nothing," Ethan muttered, heading for the stairs. "Just nothing." The next day, Ethan decided to do some digging. There had to be something about those symbols, some kind of explanation. At school, he overheard some kids talking about Pastor Collins, the town's religious leader. Apparently, the guy was a bit of a local legend, respected by everyone. People said he knew all about the town's history, every dark corner and forgotten secret. After school, Ethan headed to the church. It was a small, humble building at the center of town, but it felt off. The stained glass windows cast strange, colorful shadows on the ground as Ethan approached. Pastor Collins was in his office, a tall man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. He smiled when Ethan knocked, but there was something unsettling about it, like his eyes didn't quite match the warmth in his voice. "Ah, you must be new in town," Pastor Collins said, standing to greet him. "How can I help you, son?" Ethan hesitated. I found something in the woods. Symbols, carved into the trees." Pastor Collins's smile faltered for a split second, but it was so quick, Ethan almost missed it. "Symbols, you say?" "Yeah, and there were these stones, like some kind of circle, and a knife." Pastor Collins nodded slowly, leaning back in his chair. This town has a long history, Ethan. Some of it, well, let's just say there are things best left forgotten. The woods behind your house, they're old. Very old. People used to perform rituals there, long before this town was founded. Ethan's stomach twisted. Rituals? Dark ones. Sacrifices, some say. But that was a long time ago. Nothing to worry about now. His smile returned, but this time it didn't reach his eyes at all. Ethan left the church with more questions than answers. Pastor Collins knew more than he was letting on, and the way he had talked about the woods, it sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Days passed, and the strange occurrences around town seemed to escalate. People started disappearing. First an old woman who lived alone on the edge of town, then a young couple. No one could explain it, but rumors spread like wildfire. Some whispered about wild animals, others about something far worse. Ethan was on edge, especially after what he had seen in the woods. He started having nightmares. Dark, twisted visions of a creature lurking in the trees, watching him. In his dreams, the symbols on the trees glowed, pulsing with a sickly red light. One night, unable to sleep, Ethan decided to go back into the woods. Something was pulling him there, an invisible force that wouldn't let him rest until he uncovered the truth. He grabbed his flashlight and slipped out of the house, his breath visible in the cold night air. The woods were eerily quiet as he made his way to the clearing where he had found the symbols. The moment he stepped into the clearing, the air seemed to change, thicker, heavier, as if the very atmosphere was suffocating him. The stone circle was there, just as he had left it. But this time, something was different. There was blood. Fresh blood, smeared across the stones, dripping onto the ground. And then, he saw it. Movement just beyond the trees. He raised his flashlight, shining it into the darkness. For a brief moment, he saw a figure, tall, cloaked in shadow, with glowing red eyes staring back at him. Ethan stumbled back, his heart racing, but the figure was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He turned and ran, not stopping until he was back at the house, slamming the door behind him. He knew now. The symbols, the missing people, it was all connected. And whatever was out there, it wasn't human. Ethan's nightmares got worse. Every night, the same creature haunted his dreams, whispering in a language he didn't understand. He started noticing things around town, people acting strange, almost like they were in a trance. One evening, while sitting in his room, Ethan overheard his mom talking on the phone downstairs. She mentioned something about a special Halloween service at the church, led by Pastor Collins. Ethan froze at the mention of Halloween and the church. Pastor Collins had been acting strange ever since their conversation about the woods. There was something unsettling about him, something that made Ethan's skin crawl. And now, the town was gathering for a special service. On Halloween night, no less. Ethan had a bad feeling about it. He knew he had to go. He needed to see for himself what was happening. That night, after dinner, Sarah told Ethan they'd be attending the service too. "It's a big event here," she said, not noticing the way his face went pale. "Everyone in town goes." Ethan nodded silently. There was no way he was going to miss this, even if it scared him. Something was about to happen, and he wasn't going to sit around and do nothing. The evening came quickly, and by the time they reached the church, it was packed. The inside was dimly lit, the flickering candles casting long shadows across the pews. Everyone was there. People Ethan had seen around town, the same ones who had been acting strangely. They all had the same blank, distant expression, their eyes hollow and vacant. Pastor Collins stood at the front, his hands clasped together as he greeted each person with that unsettling smile. But this time, his smile wasn't hiding anything. It was clear, now more than ever, that he was in control. Whatever was about to happen, Pastor Collins was at the center of it. Ethan and Sarah sat near the back, but even from there, Ethan could feel the tension building in the room. It was like the air itself was alive, buzzing with an unseen energy. The service began like any other, hymns, prayers, but there was an undercurrent of something dark, something that made Ethan's chest tighten. He glanced around, noticing how the others seemed to sway slightly in their seats, as if caught in some invisible rhythm. Then Pastor Collins began his sermon. "Tonight is a special night," he said, his voice calm but with an edge that sent chills down Ethan's spine. "It is a night of renewal, a night of rebirth, For centuries, this town has been blessed by forces far older than any of us, forces that have watched over us, protected us. His eyes scanned the crowd, landing briefly on Ethan before moving on. But these forces demand respect. They demand tribute. And tonight, we shall honor them, as our ancestors did before us. Ethan's heart pounded. He knew exactly what Pastor Collins was talking about. The rituals, the sacrifices, the missing people. It was all part of this twisted tradition, and tonight was the climax. Suddenly, the doors to the church slammed shut with a deafening bang. The lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. Gasps echoed through the crowd, but no one moved. It was as if they were trapped, frozen in place. Ethan reached for his mom's hand, but she was staring blankly ahead, just like the others. "Mom?" he whispered, but she didn't respond. Panic surged through him as he shook her arm, harder this time. "Mom!" But she was gone, lost in whatever spell had taken over the rest of the town. The candles flared back to life, their flames burning unnaturally bright. Pastor Collins stepped down from the pulpit, his eyes glowing with a faint red light. He walked slowly down the aisle, his voice low and hypnotic. "The time has come," he murmured. "The offering must be made." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Offering? He tried to stand, but it was like his legs were glued to the seat. He struggled against the invisible force holding him in place, but it was no use. Suddenly, the ground beneath the altar began to shake, the floorboards creaking and groaning as something stirred below. The air grew thick with the stench of sulfur, and a deep, guttural growl rumbled through the room. Pastor Collins raised his arms, his voice rising with the growing intensity of the moment. "We summon thee, Ancient One. We offer you the blood that binds us, the fear that fuels you." The growl grew louder, and the floorboards cracked open, revealing a pit of darkness beneath the altar. From within, a massive clawed hand reached out, its fingers curling around the edge of the pit. The demon was coming. Ethan's pulse raced. He had to stop this. He didn't know how, but he couldn't let this thing be unleashed. Not here. Not now. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, he ripped free from whatever force had been holding him and stumbled to his feet. He looked around, searching for anything that could help him stop the ritual. His eyes landed on the knife, the same rusted blade he had found in the woods. It was lying on the floor near the altar, glinting in the candlelight. Without thinking, Ethan sprinted down the aisle, his heart pounding in his ears. He grabbed the knife, the cold metal sending a jolt of energy through his body. Pastor Collins turned, his glowing eyes locking onto Ethan. "You don't understand," the pastor hissed. "This is destiny. This is what must be done." But Ethan didn't care. He knew one thing for sure. This thing, this demon, could not be allowed to escape. He plunged the knife into the ground, right in the center of the summoning circle. A blinding light exploded from the blade, and the demon let out a deafening roar, its hand retracting into the pit as the ground shook violently. The candles flickered, the walls groaned, and for a moment it felt like the entire building was about to collapse. Pastor Collins screamed, his voice twisted with rage. "No, you fool, you've doomed us all." But it was too late. The pit closed with a thunderous crack, and the room fell silent. The oppressive energy that had filled the air vanished, leaving behind only the sound of Ethan's heavy breathing. He stood there, shaking, the knife still clutched in his hand. The others were slowly coming out of their trance, blinking in confusion. His mom, Sarah, looked around, her face pale and confused. "Ethan, what just happened?" she whispered. But Ethan didn't have an answer. All he knew was that they were safe, for now. The days after the ritual were a blur. The town was in shock, but no one seemed to remember exactly what had happened that night in the church. It was as if the entire event had been wiped from their memories, leaving behind only a vague sense of unease. Ethan, however, couldn't forget. He couldn't erase the images of the demon's hand, of Pastor Collins' glowing eyes, of the ancient symbols that had haunted him since the day he moved here. The town may have gone back to normal, but Ethan knew that something dark still lingered beneath the surface. Pastor Collins had disappeared after that night, leaving behind only whispers and rumors. Some said he had gone mad, others claimed he had left town. But Ethan knew the truth. The pastor had been part of something much bigger, something ancient and evil. Ethan and his mom stayed in the town for a while longer, but the feeling of dread never fully left. Every time he looked at the woods, he felt the pull, the same invisible force that had led him to those symbols in the first place. But he didn't go back. He couldn't. One day, months after the ritual, Ethan was packing up his room when he found something under his bed. It was the rusted knife, the same one he had used to stop the summoning. He hadn't seen it since that night, and yet, here it was, sitting in his room as if waiting for him. A chill ran down his spine as he picked it up, the weight of the blade feeling all too familiar in his hand. He stared at it for a long moment before wrapping it in an old cloth and hiding it away in a drawer. The town had its secrets, and so did Ethan. The cult may have been stopped, for now, but he knew it wasn't over. Not really. As they drove away from the town for good, Ethan couldn't help but glance back one last time. The trees loomed in the distance, dark and silent, but he could still feel them watching. And in the back of his mind, the whispers began again.